The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday in late April of 1878, carrying dust, 3 traveling merchants, a crate of dry goods, and a woman who did not belong to anyone in this town, not yet. Effie Yates stepped down from that coach with her left hand gripping a battered leather satchel and her right hand holding onto a small boy who could not have been more than 4 years old. The boy had dark curly hair and enormous brown eyes that took in the whole street at once, the way children do when everything is still a wonder and nothing has yet become ordinary. Effie herself was 26, with chestnut hair pinned back under a faded blue bonnet, a jaw set like she had already made up her mind about whatever argument the world intended to throw at her, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, that particular shade of green gold that shifts when the light changes. She had $41 and some coins in the small cloth purse tucked inside her bodice. She had a letter folded 4 times in her satchel, though the man who had written it was no longer alive to honor what it promised. And she had a child named Henry who was not hers by blood, who had been placed in her arms by a dying woman on a train platform in Abilene 6 weeks prior, and who had not let go of her hand since. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It sat in the lower basin of the Texas Panhandle, where the land flattened out in every direction like the earth had grown tired of hills and simply stopped trying. There was a main street with a general store, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a livery, a church whose white paint was peeling at every corner, a doctor's office, a post office, a small hotel called the Hartwell, and a scattering of homes beyond. The whole place smelled of horse and iron and sun-baked dust, and the wind came through without asking permission. Effie stood on the wooden boardwalk in front of the stage office and looked at all of it, and did not let her face betray the fact that her stomach had dropped somewhere around her knees. Henry tugged her hand. "Is this where we live now?" he asked. "It might be," she said, because she had learned in the last 6 weeks that children could tolerate uncertainty if you did not perform it for them, if you kept your voice level and your grip firm. The letter in her satchel had come from a man named Calhoun Reeves, who had placed an advertisement in the Abilene paper in February seeking a woman of good character to come and help manage the household of his newly inherited ranch outside of Harlan Creek. He had been her late sister Clara's husband's employer, once upon a time, which was how she had known his name when she saw it. She had written back, and he had responded with an offer. She had packed what she owned and bought a ticket and made her way here by rail and stage, only to learn from a wire she received in Amarillo that Calhoun Reeves had died of a heart seizure 3 weeks prior. The man who had hired her, the reason she had come to this corner of Texas, was gone. She had come anyway. There was nowhere else particular to go, and Henry needed a place to stay that was not a boarding house, and Effie had always been someone who moved toward a thing rather than away from it, even when the thing had changed shape on her. She picked up her satchel and took Henry's hand more firmly and walked down the boardwalk toward the Hartwell Hotel. She did not notice the man outside the livery until Henry noticed him first. Lionel Brenner was leaning against the post outside Hatch's livery, watching the stage unload with the particular patient attention of a man who had nowhere urgent to be for the next 10 minutes. He was 31, which in the Texas Panhandle of 1878 meant he wore it like he'd earned it, lean and weathered and unhurried, with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor since Friday. He had on a brown canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, worn boots, and a hat that had seen 3 summers at minimum. He worked the Reeves Ranch, or what remained of it now that Calhoun was gone as the head hand, managing what the estate's lawyer in Amarillo had not yet decided what to do with. He had known Calhoun Reeves for 6 years. He had liked him. He did not particularly like what grief felt like, so he had thrown himself into keeping the ranch operational while the lawyers sorted things out, which was what he knew how to do. He was not especially thinking about women or children or any of that when Effie Yates stepped off the stage. but he noticed her in the way you cannot help noticing someone who is holding themselves together very carefully. The way you can tell even from a distance that a person is managing something heavier than their luggage. And then the small boy beside her looked directly at Lionel from 30 feet away with those enormous dark eyes. And something about that look, that frank, unguarded, curious look that only small children are capable of, made Lionel push off from the post. He told himself later that he only walked over because they looked lost. That was true enough. He had a general inability to watch someone struggle with something he could help with. It was not a heroic quality particularly, it was just the way he was wired. He crossed the street, keeping his pace easy so as not to startle anybody, and when he got within a reasonable distance he touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said. "You folks looking for something or someone particular?" Effie looked at him the way a woman alone in a strange town looks at a strange man, with an assessment that happened in about 1 second and covered a great deal of ground. She had a good instinct for people. She had needed to develop one. "I'm looking for the Hartwell," she said, "and I'm also looking for the lawyer's office if there is one. I was told there might be a Mr. Danforth who handles some of the property matters in this area." Lionel's brow moved. "You hear about the Reeves estate?" Effie blinked. "I was employed by Mr. Reeves. Was being the relevant word. I only learned of his passing a few days ago. I've come anyway on account of having already set out, and now I need to understand the situation." She said this with a kind of businesslike plainness that told him she had rehearsed it, that she had needed to rehearse it to keep the worry out of it. "The Hartwell's down this way," Lionel said. He crouched down then because the boy had been staring at him with frank, unblinking curiosity the whole time, and Lionel was not a man who could ignore a child looking at him that way. He went down on one knee right there on the boardwalk so he was level with the boy's face. "Hello there," he said. "What's your name?" The boy considered him for a moment with great seriousness. "Henry," he said. "Henry, that's a good solid name." Lionel extended his hand the way he would to a man, not to a child, and Henry looked at it and then shook it with his small hand, and something about the gravity with which the boy did it made a warmth move through Lionel's chest that he had not expected. He straightened back up and found Effie watching him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between surprise and something softer. "I'm Lionel Brenner," he said. "I work the Reeves Ranch, or I have been. Come on, I'll walk you to the hotel and then point you toward Danforth's office. It's just 2 buildings over from the general store." "Thank you," Effie said, and she meant it simply, without performance. They walked down the boardwalk together, the 3 of them, with Henry between them taking steps that were too short for the pace and not minding at all. That night Effie sat in a room in the Hartwell that had a single window overlooking the alley and a bed large enough for herself and Henry, and she lay in the dark after the boy was asleep and looked at the ceiling and made herself think clearly about her situation. She had $40 left. She had no employer. She had a child who legally belonged to no one at the moment, because the papers she was trying to arrange for guardianship were still working their way through the system in Abilene, and she was not his mother in the eyes of the law, only in every other way that mattered. Her sister Clara had died of fever the previous year. Clara's husband, a man named Thomas Yates, Effie had taken his name because people stopped asking questions when a woman had a husband's name, even if the husband was long gone, had disappeared west 2 years before Clara died, leaving Clara with nothing and Effie with a choice between bitterness and practicality. She had chosen practicality. She always did. Henry was the son of a woman named Nora Cassidy, who had been on the same train platform in Abilene in early March, coughing badly and clutching the boy with the desperate grip of someone who knows they are running out of time. Nora had no family left and nowhere the boy could go, and she had looked at Effie in the way that drowning people look at the nearest solid thing, and Effie had not been able to walk away. Nora had died within the week, and Effie had Henry, and Henry had Effie, and that was the whole of it. She thought about Lionel Brenner for a moment before she stopped herself. She thought about the way he had gone down on one knee to be level with Henry. You did not do that without something genuine in you. People who were simply being polite did not do that. She told herself it was useful information about the general character of Harlan Creek's inhabitants and went to sleep. The meeting with Danforth, the lawyer, happened the next morning and went better and worse than expected simultaneously. Leland Danforth was a thin man with reading glasses and a precise manner, and he laid out the situation with the kind of directness that she appreciated even though the content of it was not simple. The Reeves estate was in the process of being settled. The ranch itself, about 800 acres with the main house, 2 bunkhouses, a well, a good stable, and a decent herd of cattle, was to be managed by the estate's executor, which was Danforth himself, until a formal decision was made about a sale or inheritance. Calhoun had no children, and his only surviving relative was a nephew in Ohio who had written to say he had no interest in ranching and wanted the place sold, which meant the ranch was functional but in a kind of legal limbo, and Lionel Brenner and 2 other hands named Amos and Cyrus were living on it and running it and had been since Calhoun died, waiting on the law to catch up with the situation. I was hired as a housekeeper, Effie said carefully. The house still needs keeping, doesn't it? Danforth looked at her over his glasses. It does, but the terms of your employment were with Mr. Reeves, and he is no longer. I understand who is and isn't alive, Mr. Danforth, Effie said, pleasantly but firmly. I'm asking whether there is a practical need for someone to manage the household while the estate is being settled, and whether the estate has the means to pay a modest wage for that service. I don't need much. I need enough to house myself and my boy and to eat decently. Danforth was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with what might have been the beginning of a smile, I believe I can authorize a modest arrangement along those lines. The estate has the liquidity. And the house is in a state, frankly. Mr. Brenner has been managing the land admirably, but he's a rancher, not a housekeeper. Effie stood up and offered her hand. Then we have a working arrangement. She walked out of that office feeling something that was not quite relief and not quite confidence, but was made of the same material as both. She found Lionel Brenner outside the Copper Nail Saloon, which was not because he was drinking, it was 9 in the morning, but because he was talking to a man about a fence post problem, and Harlan Creek was small enough that she encountered him simply by walking in that direction. He saw her and Henry and tipped his hat. How did it go with Danforth? He asked. I'm going to be keeping house at the Reeves Ranch while the estate is settled, she said. He said you're running the land operations. Something moved across Lionel's face that she read as surprise and then something less easily named. That's correct, he said. Good, she said. So we'll be working on the same property. I want you to know I'm not here to be difficult or to interfere with what you're doing with the cattle and the land. I'm here to manage the house and the cooking and whatever else needs doing on that end. Lionel looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at Henry, who was examining the dust on the boardwalk with intense interest. When do you want to go out there? He asked. Today, if it's possible. He didn't hesitate. I've got a wagon. I can take you out this afternoon. I need to pick up some things from the general store first. We'll wait, she said. They rode out to the Reeves Ranch in the early afternoon, Effie on the wagon seat beside Lionel and Henry tucked between them because the road was rutted and she didn't want him bouncing around in the back. Henry fell asleep against Lionel's arm about 20 minutes in, because children have an extraordinary capacity for trusting warmth, and Lionel held his arm very still so as not to wake the boy. Effie noticed this and looked at the road ahead. He's not mine by blood, she said after a while. She was not sure why she said it then, only that it seemed dishonest not to eventually. I figured, Lionel said, he doesn't favor you. I didn't plan it. A woman at a train station had no one. She died. He needed someone. She kept her voice even. I'm not looking for anyone to tell me what I should or shouldn't have done. I wasn't about to, Lionel said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road with the easy attention of a man who had made this drive 100 times. People say things, she said. People do, he agreed. They're often wrong." She didn't say anything to that. She looked at Henry asleep against Lionel's arm, his dark curls against the brown canvas of Lionel's sleeve, his small mouth slightly open, and she felt the particular kind of love that she had stopped being surprised by, sudden and deep, and not depending on biology at all. The Reeves Ranch house was a solid two-story structure made of timber and plank, larger than she had expected, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a barn and stable behind it and two smaller bunkhouses off to the side. The land stretched out in every direction under the wide pale sky, and there were cattle visible in the distance, a dark moving shape against the brown gold grass. It was not elegant. The porch railing needed work, and two of the shutters were crooked, and the yard had the particular neglect of a place where no one had been paying attention to the domestic details. But the bones of it were good. Amos was a man in his 50s, solid and quiet, with a sun-weathered face and a way of acknowledging a newcomer that was essentially just a nod and a return to his work, which Effie respected immediately. Cyrus was younger, perhaps mid-20s, lean and long-limbed with a mop of reddish hair and a grin that he deployed freely. He shook Effie's hand with genuine enthusiasm and then went down on his heels to say hello to Henry, and Henry regarded him with the careful assessment of a child who is deciding whether someone is trustworthy. "You like horses?" Cyrus asked Henry. Henry considered. "I don't know," he said seriously. "I've only seen them from far away." "Well, shoot," Cyrus said. "We've got plenty of them close up, you just say when." Henry looked at Effie. Effie nodded. Henry looked back at Cyrus. "Now," he said. Cyrus laughed and looked at Effie for permission, and Effie said, "Not right now, but soon." And Henry accepted this with the philosophical grace of a child who has learned that adults have a complicated relationship with time. The inside of the house was what she had expected: functional, fairly clean but definitely unloved, with a large kitchen that had a good iron stove and a pantry that was reasonably stocked, a main room with a fireplace and a dining table, and upstairs several bedrooms. Lionel showed her around with the slightly apologetic air of a man aware that he had not been keeping up the interior. "I sleep in the bunkhouse," he said. "Calhoun used to take his meals with us, but mostly I ate at my own end. The house has been empty since he passed." "It doesn't need an apology," Effie said. "It needs cleaning." She set her satchel on the kitchen table and looked around at the room with a practical eye. "And that stove pipe looks like it needs checking before I use it." "I'll check it," Lionel said. "Good. And is there a room upstairs I can put Henry in that's near to mine?" "There's two rooms on the east end." "The smaller one would suit him," she nodded. "Then we'll get settled and I'll start supper." He looked at her for a moment, and she could not tell what was in his face exactly, only that it was not nothing. "You don't have to cook for the men tonight," he said. "You just got here." "Everybody's got to eat," she said. "That's not hardship, that's just arithmetic." He left her to get settled, and she heard him outside a while later, climbing up to check the stovepipe, and then the clang and scrape of him cleaning it out, and then his voice carrying a few words to Amos below. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the edge of the table, and the late afternoon light coming through the window, and felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, something that resembled the quality of landing somewhere. She made a good supper. Salt pork and beans and corn bread and a dried apple compote from what she found in the pantry. And the four of them, Effie and Henry and Lionel and Cyrus, with Amos coming in from outside with a brief nod of thanks, ate at the big table in the main room. And the light from the kerosene lamp was warm, and the food was warm, and Henry ate everything on his plate and then fell asleep in his chair with his chin on his chest, which made Cyrus laugh quietly and Lionel reach over and catch the boy before he slipped. Lionel carried him upstairs without being asked, and Effie followed and pulled back the covers of the small east room, and Lionel set Henry down with a gentleness that was so matter-of-fact it was almost harder to witness than if he had made something of it. "Good night, Henry," he said quietly, and pulled the blanket up. Effie stood in the doorway and watched and said nothing. She lay awake that night in the adjacent room listening to the sounds of a ranch at night, the distant low of cattle, the creak of the house settling, the wind across the panhandle that never fully stopped, and she allowed herself to think about Lionel Brenner for a longer time than she had the night before. She told herself it was because her situation depended somewhat on him, on working alongside him, and therefore understanding his character was practical. This was not entirely a lie. It was just also not entirely the whole truth. The days that followed had the quality of a new thing finding its shape. She kept the house. She was efficient and unsentimental about it, working through the accumulated neglect of weeks without drama, scrubbing floors and washing windows and airing bedrooms and reorganizing the pantry. And within 3 days, the house felt inhabited rather than abandoned. She cooked 3 meals a day, and they were good meals, which was not incidental. She had always believed that good food was a form of care made practical, that feeding people well was a language available to everyone. Henry attached himself to Cyrus with the swift, unreasoning devotion of a small child who has identified someone as reliably fun. And Cyrus, who turned out to be 24 and the youngest of 6 siblings and entirely comfortable with children, obliged this attachment with cheerful good nature. Within the week, Henry had been introduced to every horse in the stable, had sat on the back of the oldest and most patient mare with Cyrus's hand steady behind him, and had developed strong opinions about which horses were good and which ones were showing off. Amos said very little to anyone, but he ate his meals with evident appreciation. And once, when Effie was hanging washing on the line behind the house and the wind was being difficult, he appeared and held the other end of the line without a word, and then went back to his work, and she understood that this was his version of warmth. Lionel worked from before dawn until the light was gone most days, managing the herd and the fences and the daily operations of a ranch that was running on its own momentum without the direction of an owner. He was methodical and unhurried and good at what he did. She could see that clearly, even from a domestic vantage point. He had a relationship with the land that was not romantic but was genuine, the way someone who has worked a thing long enough stops seeing it and starts knowing it. He did not hover around her or seek out her company, which she found she respected. He was not the kind of man who needed to be noticed, but neither did he avoid her. In the evenings when the day's work was done, he sometimes sat on the porch, and sometimes she brought out coffee and sat in the other chair, and they talked. Not about anything that constituted a declaration. About the ranch, about the cattle, about the weather and the grass and what Danforth had said in his last correspondence. About Henry, occasionally. About what Harlan Creek was like in winter. But the texture of those conversations, the ease of them, the particular quality of 2 people settling into proximity, was not nothing. One evening about 2 weeks in, Henry climbed into Lionel's lap on the porch without asking, with the absolute confidence of a child who has made a decision about a person and is now acting on it. Lionel looked down at him with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived somewhere that looked a great deal like undone, and he put his arm around the boy and went on talking about the fence situation on the north pasture, and Effie looked at the sunset over the flat Texas land and felt something in her chest shift like tectonic plates. She said, "He doesn't do that with everyone." Lionel looked at her. "Do what?" "Climb into their lap like they're furniture." Lionel looked down at Henry, who had fallen into that half-sleeping state children get in the evening when they're warm and comfortable. "I'm honored," he said, and he meant it without irony, and she believed him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why are you still here, at the ranch? You must know the estate is going to be sold. The nephew in Ohio has no interest in keeping it. You could have left when Calhoun died, found work at another outfit." Lionel was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "Calhoun gave me a chance when I needed one," he said. "I was 23 and I'd made some decisions that weren't smart, and I had a choice between more bad decisions and doing some honest work. He hired me on without asking much about the things I'd rather not have answered. I've been here 8 years. He paused. I'm not leaving until everything is sorted out properly. Feels like what I owe him. Effie held her coffee cup in both hands. That's a decent reason, she said. I've got a few decent ones, he said, and then he looked at her and looked away, and the sunset was very orange over the panhandle and the wind was soft, and she thought about that look for a long time after she went inside. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, 2 things happened that changed the texture of everything. The first was a letter from the lawyer in Abilene regarding Henry's guardianship. The paperwork was progressing, but there had been a complication. A relative of Nora Cassidy's had appeared, an uncle of some kind named Wade Cassidy, who was contesting Effie's informal arrangement and claiming an interest in the boy. The letter said that a hearing of some kind might be required, and that Effie should secure representation if possible. She read this letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and kept her face very still and her breathing very deliberate. Lionel found her there when he came in for midday coffee, and he read her face the way a man who has been paying quiet attention learns to read a face. "What is it?" he asked. She told him. She laid it out plainly, all of it, the train platform in Abilene, Nora Cassidy, the informality of her arrangement with Henry, the uncle who had appeared from nowhere after 3 months of nobody being interested in a 4-year-old boy. Lionel sat across from her at the table and listened all the way through without interrupting. "This uncle," he said, "what do you know about him?" "Nothing, only the name. The lawyer in Abilene says he's appeared and made a claim. He doesn't say what kind of man." "Men who don't want a child for 3 months and then suddenly want them," Lionel said carefully, "don't usually want them for their benefit." Effie had thought this too, and hearing him say it quietly was both a confirmation and a comfort. "I know," she said. "You need to write to the lawyer today," Lionel said. "Tell him you're settled, that you have stable employment and a proper home for the boy, that you're pursuing the guardianship formally. Can Danforth write something supporting your situation here?" "I think he would," she said. "Then ask him. I can speak to it as well if it would help. I've been here, I've seen how you are with that boy." She looked at him across the table. There was something about the straightforward way he had moved from listening to problem-solving that did not feel like someone rushing past her feelings. It felt like someone who trusted her to have the feelings on her own time and meanwhile needed to help with the practical thing. "Thank you," she said. "He's a good boy," Lionel said simply. "He deserves someone who's actually here for him." The second thing that happened was that Danforth came out to the ranch to discuss a development regarding the estate. He arrived on a Friday afternoon in his neat dark suit, looking dusty and slightly out of place against the ranch landscape, and he delivered the news at the dining table with Effie and Lionel both present, because both of them needed to hear it. The nephew in Ohio had communicated through his own lawyer that he was prepared to sell, and a buyer had expressed interest, a land company out of Fort Worth that bought up ranches in the Panhandle and ran them as investment properties, hiring and management. The offer was reasonable from an estate perspective. Danforth thought it would likely go through within 2 months. "What does that mean for the people working the land?" Effie asked. Danforth looked at her and then at Lionel. "The company has indicated they intend to maintain current operations and keep on experienced hands. That would include Mr. Brenner and the others." Lionel nodded slowly. "And the house arrangement. The company would install their own manager. A household arrangement would likely change." Danforth looked at Effie with something that was almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, Miss Yates. Your arrangement was always tied to the estate situation." After Danforth left, Effie stood on the porch and looked at the land. She was not panicking, she told herself. She had 2 months, possibly more. That was time. She would figure something out. Lionel came and stood beside her, not too close but close enough. "I'll ask around in town," he said. "See if anyone needs help. The hotel, the general store, you're a good cook. The saloon has been trying to find someone to manage meals." He stopped when she turned and looked at him with her green gold eyes and something in them that was quiet but not nothing. "I'm not going anywhere yet," she said. "I've got time." "I know," he said. "I just don't want—" He stopped. Don't want what? He looked at her for a long moment. The wind came off the panhandle and moved the loose strands of her hair at her temples. She did not look away. I don't want you to go, he said. It came out simply, without decoration, the way honest things do when you stop managing them. Effie stood very still. Henry and I have gotten used to being here, she said, which was true and was also not the whole truth, and she suspected he knew that. Yes, he said. So have I. He looked back at the land. I mean all three of you, the whole arrangement. He said the word like he knew it was insufficient and was not sure of the better word yet. Is that what we are? She said. An arrangement. I don't know what word you'd prefer, he said, and there was something almost careful in it, like a man checking the ice before he steps on it. I don't know either, she said honestly. But I think it might be more than an arrangement. He turned and looked at her. She met his eyes. The evening was coming in pink and gold over the flat land, and the cattle were distant shapes, and the house was behind them with the warm light of the lamp in the kitchen window where Henry would be inside with Cyrus, who had taken it upon himself to teach the boy to play checkers. Effie, Lionel said, and then stopped. Yes, she said. I'd like to, if you're willing. I'd like to take you to town on Saturday. For supper at the hotel, the three of you, he paused. Or just you if you'd prefer, and Cyrus can watch Henry. Another pause. Or all three of us if that's more comfortable. She laughed then because it was such an honest and slightly fumbling proposal, and he looked briefly mortified and then saw her laughing, and a slow smile came across his face that she had not seen before in that particular form, a smile that had real warmth in it, that reached all the way up. All three of us, she said. Henry would not forgive us if we went without him. All three of us then, Lionel said. They went to the hotel dining room on Saturday, and it was a good evening. The food was decent. Henry was delighted by the novelty of eating somewhere new, and he sat between them at the small table and told Lionel everything Cyrus had taught him about checkers, which was apparently a great deal, and Lionel listened to every word with the kind of attention that is indistinguishable from genuine interest. Effie watched them across the table and felt the warmth of it move through her like sun through glass. On the walk back to the wagon, Henry between them, holding both their hands, which he had decided was the correct arrangement without consulting anyone, Effie said, "He's going to want this every Saturday now." "Suits me," Lionel said. She looked at him sideways. "You're good with him," she said. "He makes it easy." "It doesn't feel easy to everyone," she said. "No, but to me it does." He paused. "I don't know entirely why. I never had. I wasn't planning on." He stopped, reorganized himself. "I just know when something is right without needing to explain it." She understood that. She understood it in the specific way of recognizing something that is also true for yourself. The letter about the guardianship hearing came a week later. It was scheduled for Abilene 6 weeks out. The uncle, Wade Cassidy, had filed a formal petition. The lawyer in Abilene, a man named Greer, wrote that Effie's case was solid, but that the hearing would require her presence and documentation proof of stable residence, employment, character references. She showed the letter to Lionel that evening on the porch. He read it carefully. He handed it back. "We'll get you the documentation," he said. "Danforth, me, Amos, Cyrus, anyone who can attest to your character and your situation here. And you have stable employment and a roof." He paused. "What do you know about this uncle?" "Greer says he's a drifter, more or less. Has lived in 3 states in the last 4 years. No permanent address currently." She folded the letter. "He doesn't want Henry. I know he doesn't. Men like that don't want children. They want whatever the children come with. And in this case, Henry doesn't come with anything except love, which a man like that," she stopped herself, "has no use for," Lionel finished quietly. "Yes. Then we make the case that Henry has exactly what he needs right here." She looked at him. "You keep saying we." Lionel held her gaze. "I do," he said. "You know that this is my problem, mine and Henry's." "I know that," he said. "I also know that I'm choosing to be part of solving it. Those two things can both be true." She was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the ranch were all around them, the distant cattle, the horses in the stable, the creak of the porch boards. "Lionel," she said, "yes. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it correctly. I'm listening." "I've been on my own for a long time," she said. "My sister is gone. The man whose name I use was never much of a presence. I have learned to be sufficient to myself, and I am proud of that. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me. I know that, he said, but I am also, she stopped, started again. I'm also not opposed to building something if the right person wanted to build it alongside me. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of something. I want that, Lionel said, quietly, directly, with no performance around it. I want it plainly and without any confusion about what I mean. I want the whole thing, you and Henry and the building of it, if you'll let me. She looked at him for a long time. I think, she said, that I am already letting you. He reached over in the dark of the porch and found her hand on the armrest of her chair and held it. Her hand was warm and work-rough and exactly right, and she turned it and laced her fingers through his, and they sat there in the dark of the Panhandle night with the stars coming out overhead and the wind soft over the flat land. And neither of them said anything else for a long time because nothing else was necessary. The next weeks had a different quality, a warmth that was out in the open now, no longer being carefully managed on either side. Lionel brought her wildflowers from the pasture, not grand gestures, just a handful of the small yellow ones that grew at the edge of the creek bed, set on the kitchen windowsill without comment, and she started leaving a cup of coffee on the porch post every morning before he came in from the early work, so it would be there when he was ready for it. These were small things. They were also the language of something growing. Henry noticed, in the way children notice things that the people around them have not announced, with a kind of pleased satisfaction, as though a theory he had been working on was proving out. He had taken to calling Lionel by his name without the formality of a title, which Lionel encouraged, and he had started saying, "our ranch," when he talked about the place, which made Cyrus raise his eyebrows at Amos, who did not respond but whose expression held something that could have been a smile if he'd let it out. Effie began writing letters in the evenings, to Greer in Abilene, to Danforth, to anyone who could support the guardianship case, and Lionel sat at the other end of the table while she wrote, going over the ranch ledgers, and the domestic ordinariness of those evenings was its own kind of profound. One night she looked up from her letter and caught him watching her instead of the ledger. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Then you write like you mean business." "I do mean business. I know, it's one of my favorite things about you." She looked at him. He had said it with such plainness that it left her briefly without a response. "You're going to make that difficult to argue with," she said finally. "That's the intention," he said, and went back to the ledger. She went to Harlan Creek on a Tuesday to speak with Danforth about the hearing, and she took Henry with her. And on the way back she stopped at the general store for flour and salt and a length of blue cotton that was on sale and that she thought might make a decent shirt for Henry. The woman behind the counter was named Martha Hale, and she had run the general store with her husband for 12 years and knew everyone and everything in Harlan Creek in the thorough way of a person who has operated the place people come to when they need something. Martha Hale looked at Effie with kind, direct eyes and said, "You're the woman out at the Reeves place." "I am," Effie said. "How are you getting on?" "Very well," Effie said. Martha cut the blue cotton with her scissors and folded it. "Lionel Brenner's a good man," she said, with the particular casualness of a woman making a statement she fully intends the other person to hear clearly. "I've known him a long time. He's not given to foolishness. If he's given his regard to someone, it means something." Effie held still while Martha wrapped the cotton. "I believe that," Effie said carefully. "Good," Martha said, and handed over the package. "That'll be 20 cents. And don't let anyone in this town give you grief about that boy. He's yours in every way that matters, and this town's seen enough of people not looking after children properly to appreciate when someone does." Effie paid the 20 cents and took her packages, and walked out with Henry's hand in hers, and felt something shift in her chest that was specifically the sensation of a community beginning to feel like it might be yours. The trouble with Wade Cassidy arrived on a Thursday, less than a week before the scheduled hearing in Abilene. Effie was in the kitchen when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard, and when she looked out the window she saw a man she did not know dismounting near the porch, lean, rough-looking, in a dusty coat with the frayed edge of someone who moves often and settles nowhere. He was perhaps 45, with a mean-set jaw and eyes that moved around the yard in a particular way she did not like. She went to the front door before he knocked. "Miss Yates," he said. He had already identified her, which meant he'd been asking around. "Who are you?" she said, though she thought she knew. "Wade Cassidy," he said. "I've come to see the boy." Her grip on the door frame tightened. "You have no legal right to come to my home and demand—" "He's my blood," Cassidy said. His voice was flat and had no warmth in it anywhere. "My brother's wife's boy. I got rights." "You have a hearing scheduled in Abilene in 6 days, Effie said. "That is the appropriate venue for this conversation. I'd like to see the boy now." "You will not," she said. He took a step toward the porch and something hardened in her entirely, and she stood her ground in the door frame and did not move. "I wouldn't do that." Lionel's voice came from the left, where he had come around the side of the house on foot, quiet as he always was, with Amos a few steps behind him. His voice was even. Not threatening exactly, but with a weight to it that was unmistakable. Cassidy looked at him, looked back at Effie. "I've got legal standing," Cassidy said. "In 6 days in Abilene before a judge," Lionel said, and he had come up close now, standing between Cassidy and the porch steps. "Not here, not today. You'll take yourself back to wherever you came from and you'll present yourself at the hearing properly, and until then this is private property and you are not welcome on it." Cassidy looked at Lionel for a long moment with the calculating look of a man deciding what kind of trouble a thing is worth, and he decided that it was not worth this particular kind. "I'll see you in Abilene," he said, which was directed at Effie. "Yes," she said, "you will." He mounted and rode back down the lane, and Effie watched him go and only then allowed herself to breathe. Lionel came up onto the porch. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, "Is Henry inside with Cyrus?" "He is." He didn't hear anything. He looked at her face. "Effie." "I'm all right," she said again. "He's a man who wants something he doesn't actually want. He wants to use this hearing to get money or leverage of some kind, not to raise a child. I know men like that." "So do I," Lionel said. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, brief, solid, warm. "We're going to Abilene." "All of us?" She looked at him. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," he said. "I want to be there if you'll let me. The others, the ranch, Amos can run things for a few days. It's not the first time." He held her gaze. "Let me come." She thought about the train platform in Abilene where it had all begun, Nora Cassidy's desperate eyes, the warm weight of Henry placed in her arms, the absolute clarity of knowing what the right thing was even when it was inconvenient. She thought about the 6 weeks since, the ranch, the evenings on the porch, the hand held in the dark, the coffee on the post every morning. "Yes," she said. "Come." They left for Abilene 3 days before the hearing, Effie and Henry and Lionel, on the stage. Henry was exhilarated by the journey in the way of children for whom travel has not yet lost its novelty, and he spent most of the ride with his face at the window asking questions about everything they passed, and Lionel answered every single one, which Effie watched from across the narrow coach with a feeling she had stopped pretending was not love. She had documents from Danforth, a letter from Martha Hale and several other townspeople, and a letter from Lionel that she had read once and folded back up, because reading it again felt like too much emotion for the preparation she needed to be doing. He had written in his careful, plain handwriting about her character, her care for Henry, her stability, her capacity. And at the end he had written that the boy was thriving, and that anyone who had spent 5 minutes at the Reeves Ranch could see clearly where Henry belonged and with whom, and that he himself stood ready to attest to any of this in any forum that required it. Greer, the lawyer in Abilene, was a compact and serious man who reviewed their documents with the focused attention of someone whose professional life was made of detail, and when he looked up he said that the case was stronger than he had anticipated. Wade Cassidy has no stable residence, no employment history worth mentioning, and no documented contact with the boy since his birth, Greer said. His claim is based solely on blood relation. Your case: stable employment, established home, consistent care for the child over several months. Community character references is substantially more compelling. Is it enough? Effie asked. Greer looked at her over his papers. I believe so. Judges in these matters are primarily concerned with the welfare of the child. You can demonstrate that clearly. The hearing was in the morning 2 days later, in a courtroom that smelled of wood and old paper, with a judge named Aldrich who had a white beard and reading glasses, and a manner that was neither warm nor cold but was scrupulously attentive. Wade Cassidy was present with his own lawyer, a thin man who looked like he had been hired cheap and knew it. Effie sat at the table with Greer and kept her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed, and answered every question directly and without embellishment. She told the story of Nora Cassidy, of the train platform, of the decision she had made. She did not perform grief or sentiment. She spoke about Henry as she knew him, his curiosity, his warmth, his recent enthusiasm for horses and for checkers, the fact that he had called her mama for the first time 2 weeks ago in the kitchen, without ceremony, the way children do when they have simply decided something true. At that last part she kept her voice perfectly level and felt Lionel in the seat behind her go very still. Greer presented the documentation: Danforth's letter, the community attestations, Lionel's letter. Judge Aldrich read each one. His face did not change. Wade Cassidy's lawyer made his argument, which was brief and unpersuasive, and consisted primarily of the word blood, which Judge Aldrich listened to with polite attention and no visible change of expression. The judge asked Cassidy directly whether he had any established residence to which the child could be taken, and Cassidy said he was in the process of settling somewhere, and the judge asked where, and Cassidy said he was considering various places. The judge made a note. The judgment came that afternoon. Judge Aldrich granted Effie Yates provisional guardianship of Henry Cassidy, to be formalized within 30 days by the filing of the proper documentation, and denied the petition of Wade Cassidy, noting that no demonstrated capacity for stable care had been established by the petitioning party, and that the child's current living situation showed every evidence of appropriate and loving provision. He said it in the dry language of the law, but the meaning of it hit Effie like warm water. She sat very still for 1 second, and then Greer put his hand on the table in front of her and said, quietly, "That's it. It's yours." She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed in once deeply. She heard Lionel behind her, and she turned, and he was standing with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that was so open it was almost startling on a man who was generally so composed, something bright and full and unguarded. "Effie," he said. She stood up from the chair, and he crossed the small distance between them, and she stepped into him, and his arms came around her, and she let herself be held, properly and completely, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, and she held on. Henry had waited outside with Greer's secretary, a kind woman named Agnes, and when they came out he looked at their faces and said, with the uncanny perceptiveness of small children, "Is everything all right now?" Effie crouched down to his level and held his face in her hands and said, "Everything is very all right." She kissed his forehead. Henry considered this and then looked at Lionel standing behind her. "Is Lionel staying?" he asked. Lionel looked down at him. "Yes," he said, "I'm staying." "Good," Henry said, and took both their hands, and they walked out of the courthouse together into the warm Abilene afternoon. They spent the night in Abilene before heading back, and in the evening after Henry was asleep, Effie and Lionel sat in the small parlor of the hotel, and Effie finally opened the feeling she had been keeping orderly all day and let it just exist. And some of it came out in quiet crying that she did not apologize for. And Lionel sat with her through all of it without fixing it or hurrying it, just present and steady, his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. When it had passed, she felt emptied out in the clean way, and she said, "I have been carrying that for 6 weeks. "I know," he said. "I am not generally a person who cries." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Lionel, Yes. When we go back to Harlan Creek, she said, and the ranch is eventually sold and things change, and they will, things always change, I don't want to lose what we've been building. Neither do I, he said. I need to know what you want, actually want. Not implied, not suggested. I need it said plainly. He looked at her steadily. I want to marry you, he said. I want Henry to have a proper father who has earned the title. I want to build something with you, whether it's on that ranch or somewhere else. It doesn't matter to me as long as you're both in it. He paused. That's plain enough. That's plain enough, she said. I haven't got a ring, he said. I didn't know this was the night. She laughed, which was not the response he might have expected and was clearly not a bad one because he smiled that full warmth smile that she had come to look for. I don't need it tonight, she said. Ask me again when we're home. I'll hold you to that, he said. I'm counting on it, she said. They returned to Harlan Creek on the stage 2 days later, and the ranch received them back with the uncomplicated welcome of a place that had simply continued being itself while they were gone. Amos had managed everything without incident. Cyrus had apparently spent the evenings reading aloud from the almanac to a cat that had taken up residence in the stable, which he admitted to only when Henry directly asked where the cat was. The weeks that followed had an easiness to them that Effie had not quite experienced before in her life. The guardianship papers were filed and processed within the month. Henry was hers in the law's eyes, as he had always been in every other sense. He celebrated this news by pronouncing that they should have pie, and Effie made one, and they all ate it on the porch, and it was a good day. The news from Danforth regarding the estate sale firmed up in late June. The Fort Worth Land Company had made a formal offer that the Ohio nephew was likely to accept. The sale would close within 60 days, which meant the working arrangement at the ranch had a defined end, even if the new company intended to keep the hands-on. Lionel came in from a long day in the south pasture one evening and found Effie on the porch as he often did, and he sat down in his chair and looked at the last light on the land for a while, and then he reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the armrest between them. It was a ring, a small gold ring with a simple setting, a single dark red stone that caught the last light. I got it from Martha Hale, he said. It came through from a jeweler in Amarillo. I know it's not grand. Effie looked at it and then at him. It's perfect, she said. Effie Yates, he said. Will you marry me? Yes, she said. She did not make him wait for it because she had known since the hotel parlor in Abilene and possibly before that, possibly since the day he had gone down on one knee on the boardwalk to say hello to Henry, which she was not sure she had fully admitted to herself until right now. He picked up the ring and she held out her hand and he put it on, and it fit almost perfectly, which Martha Hale had apparently achieved by intuition. She looked at it on her hand and then at him, and he was watching her face with the unguarded openness she had come to recognize as the version of him that was most entirely himself. And she leaned across the space between the chairs and kissed him, properly, her hand against his jaw, and the panhandle evening came in around them warm and soft with the smell of grass and dust, and everything that was becoming home. They were married 6 weeks later, in the church with the peeling white paint, on a Saturday morning in August of 1878. Reverend Tate, a patient and decent man who had been in Harlan Creek for 15 years, performed the ceremony. Martha Hale was there, and her husband Clifton, and Danforth, and Cyrus and Amos, who both wore their good shirts, and a scattering of townspeople who had come to know Effie over the preceding months and wanted to witness the event. The church smelled of wood and candle wax and the wildflowers that Effie had arranged in 2 tin cans on the altar, the small yellow ones from the creek bed, and some white ones that grew behind the stable. Henry stood beside Lionel during the ceremony, which had not been planned but which Henry had arranged by simply standing where he stood, and no one had the heart to redirect him. He wore a new blue shirt cut from the blue cotton Effie had bought at the general store, and he was extremely serious about the whole proceeding, which made Cyrus have to look at the ceiling at least twice. When the Reverend came to the part about family and the building of a home, Henry took Lionel's hand and Lionel looked down at him, and something moved across his face that Effie saw from 2 feet away, and that she would carry in her memory with great care for the rest of her life. She said her vows looking at Lionel and meaning every syllable of them, not as a performance, not as a form, but as a plain and accurate description of a choice she was making with her whole self. He said his the same way, and his voice did not waver. They were pronounced husband and wife in the small white church with the peeling paint on the last Saturday of August, 1878, with Henry still holding Lionel's hand, and the town of Harlan Creek applauded with the genuine warmth of a community that is glad for a good thing. The reception was held outside the hotel, and Martha Hale had organized most of it without being asked, and there was food and fiddle music, and Henry fell asleep under one of the tables before 9 o'clock and was carried home by his father. A word Effie had started using in her mind without needing to announce it, because it was simply accurate, and Effie danced with Lionel on the dusty street while the fiddle played something slow, and the stars were very bright overhead. "Are you happy?" he asked her quietly while they danced. "Yes," she said, "entirely and completely." "Good," he said. "That's what I intend to keep happening." She laughed against his shoulder, and they danced until the fiddle player's arm gave out, and then they walked home under the stars. The Fort Worth Land Company finalized the purchase of the Reeves Ranch in September. As Danforth had indicated they would, they offered to retain Lionel as head manager of the property, which was an offer with a decent wage and a manager's cottage on the property, a small separate house off the eastern side of the main house, 2 proper rooms and a kitchen and a porch. It was not grand. It was solid and dry, and it was on the land that Lionel knew the way he knew his own hands. He talked it through with Effie before agreeing, which she noted with the particular appreciation of a person who had not always been talked through things. "The new company is going to be hands-off," he said. "They want the land operational and the cattle run properly. They're not interested in the day-to-day. It's essentially the same work but with a more formal arrangement and a wage. And the cottage, it's ours, included in the employment, for as long as I work the land." "Which is not permanent," she said. "Nothing is permanent," he said, "but it's good for now, and I've been thinking." He paused. "I've been saving for a while, not a great deal, but some. If we stayed 2 or 3 years and I kept saving, there might be enough to put toward a piece of land of our own eventually, something small, enough for a garden and some cattle and room to breathe." She looked at him across the table. Henry was in the other room engaged in a complex enterprise involving blocks and a general narrative that he periodically reported on to whoever would listen. "You've been planning," she said. "I've been hoping," he said. "There's a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Take the job. We'll plan together." He agreed to the Fort Worth Company's terms, and they moved into the manager's cottage in October, which Effie immediately made into a home with a thoroughness and a care that was visible in every corner. Clean curtains in the windows, a rag rug on the main room floor, her dried herbs hung in the kitchen, Lionel's boots on the mat inside the door, Henry's drawings on the wall beside the fireplace, which were mostly horses and one very abstract shape that Henry described as Amos, which everyone accepted without question. Cyrus stayed on as a hand under Lionel's management. Amos stayed through the winter and then took a job elsewhere in the spring, which he announced with the minimum number of words possible, and which no one took personally. He shook Effie's hand when he left and patted Henry on the shoulder, and told Lionel that he was a reliable person, which coming from Amos was a considerable speech. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and dry, and sometimes brutal in the way Panhandle winters are, with northers that came down sudden and mean, and turned the sky white. And Lionel worked through all of it with the methodical stamina of a man who does not have the option of stopping. And Effie kept the cottage warm and the food good, and learned from Mrs. Tate at the church about making proper preserves. And Henry grew, by what seemed to be several inches between October and March, and started asking daily whether he was old enough for school yet. There was a school in Harlan Creek, a single-room schoolhouse run by a woman named Miss Elspeth Warren, who was serious and capable, and who, when Effie went to inquire about enrollment for the fall, asked Henry several questions in the manner of someone testing the waters, and Henry answered them all with his characteristic gravity, and then asked her whether the school had books about horses, and Miss Warren said that it did not currently, but that she would see what she could do. And Henry said that would be acceptable. "I think she likes him," Lionel said when Effie reported this exchange. "She was assessing him," Effie said. "She decided he was worth taking on." "Of course she did," Lionel said. Spring came to the Panhandle in early April of 1879, with the quality of a promise kept, the grass greening in the creek bed, the cattle settling into the easier rhythms of warmer weather, the days lengthening in a way that felt generous. Effie planted a kitchen garden behind the cottage, which was not a simple undertaking in Panhandle soil, but which she approached with her characteristic combination of practicality and stubbornness, and which Lionel helped with on the weekends, digging and hauling while she directed, until they had a good stretch of prepared ground where she put in beans and squash and onions, and a row of tomatoes that she was cautiously optimistic about. It was in the spring, on an evening in April, that she told him. She had planned how to say it and then discarded the plan because it was unnecessary. The best things she had learned did not require preamble. He was at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger when she came in from outside, and she sat down across from him and waited until he looked up. "I'm expecting," she said. He looked at her. She watched his face move through something complicated surprise, and then something that was not yet formed into a clear expression, and then a clearing, a brightening, the same quality of openness she had first seen in the courthouse in Abilene, and she knew before he said a word that it was good. He set down the pencil and stood up and came around the table and took her face in both his hands the way you handle something very precious, and he looked at her for a moment and then pressed his forehead to hers. "Good God," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said, "but well. You should have told me sooner. I wanted to be certain." He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth, very gently, and held her for a long time in the kitchen with the evening coming in through the window. Henry was informed the following morning at breakfast, because secrets were not a currency Effie believed in where children were concerned. Henry received the news of a coming sibling with the thoughtful expression of someone conducting a strategic analysis. "Is it a boy or a girl?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Effie said. Henry considered. "I think a boy," he said, "so I can teach him things." "You could teach a girl too," Lionel said. Henry appeared to concede this point. "That's true," he said. "I know a lot of things." This was delivered without a trace of arrogance, simply as a factual inventory, and Effie pressed her lips together to keep the smile from being quite as large as it wanted to be. Henry began first grade at Miss Warren's school in the fall of 1879, and he took to it with a thoroughness that surprised no one who knew him. Miss Warren sent a note home at the end of the first month, saying that Henry was an excellent student with a particular aptitude for figures and an impressive vocabulary for a 5-year-old, and that she did find him occasionally inclined toward conducting independent research into topics of his own choosing, when he felt the curriculum had moved on too quickly, but that this was manageable. Effie read this note aloud to Lionel at the dinner table, and both of them held their faces very carefully neutral until Henry was not looking. The baby came in November of 1879, a boy, which made Henry's quiet sense of vindication very tangible, and they named him Thomas James Brenner Thomas for its solidness and James for Lionel's father, who had died when Lionel was 17, and whom Lionel spoke of rarely but with the quality of someone who still carried the loss carefully. Thomas was a healthy, loud, emphatic baby who expressed his opinions about every situation with full force and no diplomacy, and Henry took one look at him in the first hour and declared, with the gravity of a 6-year-old who has just accepted an important responsibility, "I'll look after him." He meant it. He was the kind of person who meant things. Effie recovered from the birth with the practical resilience that characterized her approach to most things, and the cottage in winter was full and warm, and loud in a way that was entirely different from the loneliness she had once been very practiced at managing. Lionel woke in the night for Thomas's feeding without being asked, moving quietly in the dark, and in the mornings he made coffee before anyone else was up and left her cup on the table where she would find it, which was the same gesture as the cup on the porch post, only now indoors, only now with a child's sounds in the background and a ring on her hand. The 2 years that followed had the quality of a life genuinely in progress, not the precarious forward motion of someone holding things together with effort, but the deep ongoing rhythm of something that has taken root. Lionel managed the ranch through 2 full seasons for the Fort Worth Company, and he was good at it, and they knew he was good at it and paid him accordingly, and he saved carefully toward what he had told Effie he was hoping for. In the spring of 1881, he sat down with her at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and some figures, and told her that he thought they might have enough, if they found the right piece of land, to put a decent offer on something modest. They talked about it for 3 evenings in a row, what they needed, what they could manage, what the land around Harlan Creek offered, and what its limits were. There was a parcel 8 miles east of town, about 240 acres, with a creek running through the east edge and a low rise that broke the worst of the wind, and a house on it that needed significant work but had good bones. The man who had owned it had moved to his daughter's place in Kansas after his wife passed, and the asking price was something that Lionel's savings, combined with a loan from Danforth, who had decided over the preceding 2 years that he trusted Lionel Brenner entirely, could cover. "It's not the Reeves place," Lionel said, looking at the figures. "No," Effie said, "it needs a lot of work." "Yes, the house is, I've seen worse," she said. "I've fixed worse." He looked at her across the table. "Do you want it?" She thought about the flat land and the creek and the low rise and the house with the good bones. She thought about a garden larger than the one behind the cottage, about room for cattle and the possibility of a few horses, about Henry having the run of 240 acres, about Thomas growing up with actual land under his feet. "Yes," she said, "I want it." He put in the offer the following week. It was accepted. The summer of 1881 was the summer they moved into their own place and fixed it up simultaneously, which was occasionally chaotic and always exhausting, and frequently a problem that required solving with more ingenuity than materials, and was also one of the best times of Effie's life. Cyrus came on weekends to help with the heavier work. He was still running with the Reeves Ranch crew under the new company's management, and Martha Hale's husband Clifton came twice to help with the roof repair, and would not hear of being compensated because, he said, that was not how neighbors worked. The Reverend's wife sent over food on 2 separate occasions without being asked. Miss Warren contributed a hand-drawn map of the county that she thought might be useful when Henry needed to understand his new territory, which Henry received as a serious gift and hung on his bedroom wall alongside his horse drawings. Henry was 8 by then, and had grown into a boy who was quiet and observant and occasionally startling in his depth, who loved animals and numbers, and his brother Thomas with a ferocity that expressed itself largely in patient, devoted supervision. Thomas, at almost 2, was ambulatory and curious, and had no discernible sense of personal limitation, which made the supervision necessary and the supervision of the supervision sometimes necessary too. Effie painted the kitchen a pale yellow. It was the first room she painted. Lionel asked her why yellow specifically, and she said because it looked like the inside of something warm, which he thought about for a moment, and then said made complete sense. She planted the new garden in August, which was an ambitious timeline, but she had plants from the cottage garden to transplant, and a year's worth of seeds she had been saving, and she spent 3 consecutive evenings on her knees in the dirt with Henry beside her. He had developed a genuine interest in the kitchen garden, approaching it with the same methodical curiosity he brought to everything. And by September, she had green things coming up in the new plot, and the particular satisfaction of having made something grow in ground that was yours. On a September evening in 1881, Effie stood on the porch of her own house on her own land and watched Lionel come in from the east pasture on horseback, the long golden light of late afternoon behind him, Thomas on his hip, because he had taken the boy out with him for an hour the way he had started doing, and Henry running beside the horse with the easy, long-legged lope of a child who has grown up on open land. The cattle were visible in the middle distance, and the creek caught the light at the eastern edge of the property, and the house behind her smelled of supper cooking and paint, and the particular smell of a place that is being genuinely lived in. Lionel saw her on the porch, and the smile that came across his face was unhurried and complete. "Supper ready?" he called. "Almost," she called back. Thomas stretched his arms toward her from his father's hip, and made a sound that was partly her name and partly just enthusiasm, and she went down the porch steps and took him and kissed his hair and walked back up beside Lionel, who had dismounted, and they stood together on the porch of their own house with their children and the evening coming in, and the land stretched out in every direction, and the whole complicated, improbable, abundant life they had built lay out before them like something lit from inside. Henry appeared beside her and took her hand, then Lionel's, in the unself-conscious way he always had of making these small connections as though closing a circuit. "It's a good place," he said seriously, looking out at the land. "Yes, it is," Effie said. "We should get more horses," Henry said. "Talk to your father," Effie said. Lionel looked at Henry with his full warmth smile. "Come see me tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll look at the figures." Henry considered this and nodded as though a meeting had been scheduled. Thomas said something emphatic from Effie's arms that they all agreed to interpret as agreement. By the end of 1881, the house on the east parcel was properly finished, the roof sound, the windows good, the kitchen yellow, 3 bedrooms on the second floor, a porch that ran the full front of the house with a swing that Lionel built on a Sunday afternoon, while Henry held the pieces and Thomas supervised from the yard. They had a small herd of cattle, 2 working horses, and 1 horse acquired specifically because Henry had presented a written case for it, complete with figures on what it would eat and what it could contribute, which Lionel had read in full and then looked at Effie and looked back at Henry and said, "That's a thorough argument," and Henry had said, "I know," and the horse had been acquired. The horse's name, decided by Henry after 2 days of deliberation, was General, which everyone accepted as appropriate. In the spring of 1882, Effie told Lionel she was expecting again. He received this news with the same quality of opening that she had first seen in him, and had never stopped being grateful for the brightness, the unguarded gladness, the hands coming to her face. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Better than last time." "Good," he said. "Good." He kissed her and held her for a long time in the morning kitchen with the yellow walls and the sound of Henry upstairs getting ready for school and Thomas doing something in the main room with blocks that involved periodic narration. "Another boy," he said. "I don't know. Henry will have opinions." "Henry always has opinions. It's one of his best qualities." "Takes after his mother," Lionel said. She looked at him with the dry amusement that was one of her great pleasures and that she knew he relied on. "Is that so?" "Completely." She kissed him again, which settled the matter. Their daughter was born in October of 1882, and they named her Clara for Effie's sister, and she arrived with a full head of dark hair and an expression that Cyrus, when he visited, said was already managing the room. Thomas, 3 years old and firm in his conviction that the world revolved around him, required a brief period of adjustment, and then decided that the baby was interesting and therefore acceptable, and designated himself her official explainer of things, which was a role he continued to perform for years. Henry at 9 held Clara with the careful, competent tenderness of a boy who has been practicing being responsible for a long time and has gotten very good at it. He held her and looked at her small face and said to Effie, "She has your eyes." Effie looked at her daughter's eyes, that green gold, that shift in the light, and felt something that went all the way down. "She does," she said. Henry nodded, satisfied, as though this had confirmed something he already knew. Lionel sat on the edge of the bed that evening with Clara in his arms, and Effie watched him look at their daughter with the particular face of a man who has been given more than he expected from life and has the grace to know it, and she reached over and put her hand on his arm. "Lionel," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." "Go ahead." "When I stepped off that stage in Harlan Creek in 1878, she said, "I had $41 and a child who wasn't mine and a letter from a dead man and no plan except forward." "I know," he said. "I watched you step off. And in 4 years I have you and 3 children and 240 acres and a yellow kitchen and a horse named General." He looked at her, and the warmth in his face was everything it had always been. "That's a good accounting," he said. "I think so," she said. "I wanted you to know that I know it, that I don't take any of it for granted." "Neither do I," he said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Clara slept in his other arm with the absolute trust of the newly arrived. And the house settled around them. Thomas asleep down the hall, Henry reading by the light of a candle he had been told to extinguish 20 minutes ago, the cattle in the pasture, the creek catching the moonlight at the eastern edge of the land, and the life they had made was whole and real and entirely theirs. There would be other seasons after this one, hard ones, because the Panhandle was not sentimental about hardship, and there would be drought years and cold winters, and the 1,000 practical difficulties of running a working ranch with a family on it. There would be years when the cattle prices dropped and years when the garden failed, and at least one spring when the creek flooded its bank and took out 2 fence lines and part of the equipment shed, and required 3 weeks of solid work to fix. But there would also be summer evenings on the porch with the children running the pasture in the last light. There would be Henry bringing home his first real school prize, a book about natural science that he read cover to cover twice, and then read aloud to anyone who would sit still. There would be Thomas learning to ride and approaching the skill with a recklessness that required intervention, and also, privately, admiration. And there would be Clara at 4 years old announcing at the breakfast table that she intended to be a doctor, which no one disputed, because Clara's intentions had a way of becoming facts. There would be Saturday evenings in Harlan Creek, at the hotel dining room or at Martha Hale's table, because Martha had decided they were family and had not asked permission. There would be church on Sundays, and the slow way the town became theirs, known and knowing, part of a community that had its problems and its injustices, because 1882 Texas was not without them, and Effie was not a woman who looked away from those things. She had opinions about the treatment of the Comanche people on the land that had been theirs not long before, and she said them, which made some people in Harlan Creek uncomfortable, and others relieved to hear someone say it plainly. Lionel backed her in this as in everything, which she loved him for specifically. But in that October evening in 1882, in the bedroom with the yellow kitchen below them and the land outside the window and the children in the house, the whole of it was present and luminous and entirely enough. Lionel kissed the top of Effie's head. "Forward," he said, because she had once used the word and he remembered everything she ever said. "Forward," she agreed, and meant it in every direction, into the night, into the morning, into the years that were coming, into all of it together. She had arrived with a child who was not hers, carrying $41 and a determination that did not require permission from anyone, and she had been met by a man who went down on one knee in the dust of a boardwalk to say hello to a small boy with honest eyes, and from those 2 gestures, her forward motion and his kneeling down, everything else had grown. The ranch, the cottage, the the land with the creek and the low rise, the yellow kitchen, the children, the life. All of it growing from that first hello, offered simply and without calculation to them both. The Panhandle night was very dark and very wide and full of stars, and inside the house on the east parcel outside Harlan Creek, Texas, in the fall of 1882, the lamps were lit and the people were home and everything was well.